Welcome to Marketing Brew Weekly, Morning Brew Inc.'s podcast for the marketing industry. I'm Jenny Mywin.
I'm Kelsey Sutton.
And I'm Katie Hicks.
So before we get into today's episode, I want to talk about something very important, which is that we are headed to the Cannes Lion Festival. So that means some important things. So next week, we are going to have a special episode that will come out on Monday, not Wednesday, which will be coming from the festival itself. And then on Thursday, we are going to be recording the pod live at Cannes at FQ Beach. That's going to come out the following week. But if you are in Cannes Lion and you want to come in person, you can. So you can find more information about that in the show notes. We'd love to see you there.
If you're a fan, please do come. It would be really nice to have an audience.
I completely agree. Okay, so enough about that. Let's get into today's episode. So for the last couple of years, corporate support for Pride has been going down. And last year, New York City Pride, which is the biggest Pride festival in the world, lost out on an estimated $750,000 of corporate sponsorship after the federal administration announced a crackdown on DEI and quote-unquote woke initiatives.
It's a big number. It's crazy to think about how much corporate support has died down in the last few years, especially considering how many brands used to just slap a rainbow on their logo or do more than that. And now it's just so taboo. But it's also not necessarily surprising, unfortunately, considering we've seen growing silence around heritage months like Black History Month, Women's History Month. Juneteenth is also this month, expecting to see not much clamor there.
Yeah, but I think it's also like shocking because it used to be like such a sure bet, right? Like turning your logo rainbow colors was like so easy and everyone loved it. And now it's like there's so much
Everyone wanted a
hesitation.
pride float, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe it's optimistic of us, but this phenomenon doesn't feel so much like permanent as it does cyclical. So it's kind of got us wondering across the board, can Pride and other heritage months make a marketing comeback? We're going to try and answer that question, but before we get too deep into it, a quick message from our sponsor. Are you out of breath trying to keep up with AI and all the changes it's constantly creating?
It can be exhausting, we know. That's why Morning Brew created a new podcast with PwC called The Intelligence Shift.
This 8-episode series focuses on how AI is changing and disrupting different industries. Topics span from the music industry's reckoning with AI to how HR is using AI to scout top talent.
An impressive roster of leaders joins host Dan Priest to discuss real stories and real lessons learned from AI.
So if you're looking for trusted guidance about how to turn AI strategy into action, this show is for you.
Take a breather and learn from experts with experience. Listen to The Intelligence Shift wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, Katie, I want to ask you, you have been covering this for several years, and I want to get to sort of the nexus or like the beginning of this pullback. So, this is maybe the third or fourth year where we've kind of seen a pullback from sponsors, particularly in Pride Month. But when do you think it all started?
I mean, we really saw like peak woke, I would say, in like 2020. It felt like every brand was making a statement on every Heritage Month possible, every event, every social justice initiative they could think of. And then in 2023, when Bud Light worked with a transgender influencer, we saw a huge conservative backlash that I think really spooked a lot of other brands. And that was in the spring of 2023. And a few months later, Target had their Pride collection come out, and they got backlash that year from more conservative activists. So they pulled back, and then in turn, people got mad at them for pulling back, and it was kind of being attacked from all sides. And I think a lot of brands, again, looked at that and they went, oh, we don't want to be next.
I feel like there's so much fear here of just like becoming the discourse and like whether you take a Pride supportive stance or you pull back. Like Target is a really interesting example of that, where they kind of did both things and got backlash no matter what direction they went. And that is bad marketing at the end of the day.
And I think you could look at both brands and say it was two examples of brands not doubling down on the stance they had made. It was them trying to react to something that I think ultimately blew it further out of proportion. If they had just said, you know what, no, we're sticking by our work with Dylan Mulvaney, the influencer, for Bud Light, or if Target had said, you know what, we're keeping our Pride collection the same size, we're going to continue to market it, I wonder how it would have turned out. But it did feel like they were trying to react to what they felt like was a shifting tide. And in turn, I mean, we're still seeing people say they don't want to support Target anymore because they felt like they were betrayed by the brand.
I think something that's really interesting is I think these are examples of brands like not kind of understanding like the changing like cultural force. And I don't want to say that like being like anti-LGBT is like a cultural phenomenon that is like a large or incredibly popular one, because it's not. But I think that because there was this kind of growing popularity and it was very common for brands to put out Pride Month marketing around various heritage months, and it was sort of like received positively, warmly, or otherwise like lukewarm. It was like, okay, fine, you're doing something. It's table stakes. Everybody's doing a Pride Month marketing effort. Like, are you taking it to the next level, et cetera? And then sort of like in the background, there was this sort of swell of this conservative effort to try to punish these companies, or like, find that inroads. And of course, it's not the podcast for us to talk about that it's well-funded, et cetera, but like that is all like a very intentional effort. And it's like a brand not knowing that was coming at the same time. So I imagine that the conversations around that were like, yeah, we've all been doing this all the time. Like, what's the worst that can happen? And now I think brands kind of know the worst that can happen is that there might be a concerted effort to try to like ruin your brand.
Yeah, to push back against it as much as they can.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about that, though, is I agree with you, Kelsey. Like, it does signal that they kind of didn't see that this, like, opposite wave was coming. But I think it creates a lot of backlash either way, because it signals, to me, a brand that is not clear in its own brand values. If it is waiting to see where the tides turn and where popular culture is shifting and where they're getting the most backlash to then shift like what their stance is on supporting Pride or any other heritage month, you're gonna get critique for that, because it's kind of like, oh, you don't really stand for anything at the end of the day. It's pretty transparent that like you're doing this because it's what the cool kids are doing.
Well, that's the crux of the rainbow washing allegations, right? Like, a lot of people, when it was very common for brands to slap a rainbow on anything, that was what people would say is like, okay, you can market to us, market to the LGBTQ community, but what are you actually doing in your brand values that signals that you are an ally, that you are helping us? And I think a lot of brands were just kind of thinking, you know what, other brands are doing this. It's a good marketing opportunity. It's maybe going to drive revenue for us and appeal us to a different demographic. But ultimately, it's more than just a marketing demo. And you have to realize that like this comes with, more expectation, especially if you're a corporation that has money that could help people in these demographics. And that's what Pride's all about. It's all about like, helping people and making sure that everybody feels included and makes sure that everyone has the resources they need. And yeah, putting a rainbow logo on something is not the solution to that.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that brings us to now, which is that there are brands that are still asking themselves, where do we fit into this space? Like, is it a place for us? Outwardly, inwardly, like what are our policies, et cetera. And I think that's a really, a big thing that we're kind of tracking is like this, either a pullback or a lack of transparency about it. So HRC puts out a corporate equality index, and we've seen kind of brands, big companies that are, own major brands are sort of not disclosing some of like their practices or documenting them. And I think part of that is because, there's just this question of like, well, what might happen to this corporate entity if we are to do this loudly and proudly when the administration is saying like, we'll investigate you potentially. That's like a big question. But I think that we are seeing some brands continue to stick with this and say, this is a moment for us to connect and diversity and inclusion is important to who we are as a brand or as a company. Katie or Jenemiah, I'd love to know what you guys have seen this time around so far.
I think what's interesting is, so last year there were quite a few brands that dropped out of their corporate sponsorship of like New York City Pride or San Francisco Pride. And that was in response to what you mentioned, I think fear around the current administration, which has cracked down on companies that promote DE&I. They've said they'll stop mergers from happening. They'll basically inflict some sort of business consequence on those that choose to speak out on anything DE&I related. So we saw big companies like MasterCard, Nissan, PepsiCo, Citi, Diageo, Anheuser-Busch, Comcast, all pulled out of their Pride sponsorships last year. What's interesting, though, is this year, New York City Pride still has 90 corporate sponsors, but MasterCard, even though they're not an official sponsor, they're still walking in the parade. They paid for 100 employees to walk in the parade. Starbucks is going to hand out coffee at Pride in San Francisco, but they're skipping their sponsorship. So it's almost like brands are still participating. Not everyone. Some of them have fully like just taken a break, but some of them are just dialing it back. And I think that's for visibility reasons. I think they don't want to be the next target.
Sure. I think it's interesting, though, that they're dialing it back monetarily, like not sponsoring, but showing up in the actual parade. Because I think if you think about it from a consumer perspective, what is the difference in that impact if you are going to the New York City Pride Parade, for example, and you see MasterCard's like float or their 100 employees, you're like, oh, MasterCard is like involved with Pride, supports Pride. How public is it? How top of mind is it that they are pulling back their actual monetary sponsorship? It's almost like they're
Their cake and to eat it too.
Yes, they're kind of being able to do both.
And that's the thing, because like these Pride organizers are saying, like, we don't have as much money. We've had to pull back on other events that surrounded the parades. We have to like work with limited budgets this year. So it is kind of unfortunate to see that like they're struggling and their corporate sponsors are like, that's too bad. We're still going to be there, but we're not going to help with that problem.
Right. And yeah, Christina Monlos talked with NYC Pride recently for a story for us. And I think this year they're working with a budget of $3.2 million. Compare that to 2024 when they had $4.1 million. So there's a big budget difference with this kind of pullback. Something that I thought was really interesting too is that the person that Christina talked to, the executive director said that there are some opportunities for being a silent partner. So a company that comes in and offers monetary support but does not get this big, huge logo or et cetera. And I kind of think that's a really interesting development, because when we talk about values and we talk about like a corporate value or brand value, like one of the things that we have always talked about with the rainbow washing or et cetera, it's like somebody sees maybe a giant logo and is like immediately skeptical. Like, are you actually doing this in good faith, or are you doing this for some cynical, business reason? And I feel like being a silent partner, you don't get any of the like marketing benefit, but like that is a way for a brand to put their money where their mouth is, or a corporate entity of some kind. So I think that's a really interesting development where brands are going, I don't want to be this like in the news cycle for 3 weeks about something, because that would be extremely damaging. But we are going to support it in this different way. But that, again, it's like, okay, so do you just never message around it? Do you message it later when the tides have turned, when it's a little bit more, I don't know. I think that's just an interesting thing.
It's kind of an interesting opposite phenomenon of what we were just saying with like showing up at the parade, but like pulling back on your sponsorship. This is the actual contrast of that, where it's like you are still sending your money in, but you don't want people talking about it, which like I feel like is a rare thing in the marketing world. In what world are you ever doing something, spending money and not wanting people to know about it? It's an interesting strategy that's come out of this moment.
I do wonder if it's like an internal marketing strategy to show your employees that you stand with them. I think there's some value in that too. I mean, again, like to your point, you're not getting the marketing like brand perception benefits, but you're at least signaling to the people who work for your company that like we stand by you if you're within this community.
Yeah, definitely. The other piece that I feel like is always talked about around Pride in particular are Pride collections, Pride merch. Kelsey, you asked like what we've seen this year of brands that are like continuing to stick by it. The one that I've seen discussed a lot online is Abercrombie and Fitch. They have a like clothing line that's put out. I feel like a big thing that happens on the internet is just like reviewing various brands' Pride collections and whether people like it or not, whether they think it's cool. And I feel like Abercrombie & Fitch has kind of risen to the top, at least in my corner of the internet, of like doing Pride merch in a way that is fun and like signals that they get it, and it is actually like something of value to people that want to wear Pride merch. And I think they are putting their brand behind it in a way that is expected, but are also working with organizations like the Trevor Fund. So I think there's like a two-pronged approach there that feels like it shouldn't be that shocking or like that out of the ordinary, but as so many brands are pulling out of Pride sponsorships, I think the fact that they are like doubling down does stand out.
Yeah. That was something like when I was reporting on this last year, just talking to experts about like what should brands do if they are still involved in Pride. And the big thing was like stand 10 toes down on it and make sure you are investing in something that goes beyond just like a revenue opportunity. Because if people see you're just trying to make money off merch or whatever, and you're not doing anything else to help the community, I think that doesn't resonate as well. And again, leads to this question of rainbow washing. So yeah, Abercrombie and Fitch working with the Trevor Project is huge. I think other brands have also worked with some other, I think Levi's is working with another organization, Together We Ride, which pays homage to the queer motorcycle community. Didn't know that was a big community, but that's a fun thing. I mean, I feel like just finding a niche as a brand is like so big, and like that makes sense for Levi's as like a denim company.
I think finding like organizations that make sense for your brand to work with is a big piece of this particular strategy, because it's like yes, like people know who the Trevor Project is, like that is an admirable thing, but I think for Levi's to find an organization that clearly means something to a segment of the queer community and tying it back to like their own brand, it signals that Levi's is trying with intention here and not just like doing the easiest thing that they could have possibly done in terms of partners or wherever they're putting their money.
Yeah, I think they found two groups in the queer motorcycle community, which I think is such an interesting, like, I did not know that those organizations existed, and that's really cool. I think something that's really interesting here as a dynamic, and I love that we also like pulled two denim brands to talk about, but I think something that's really interesting is brands have to navigate this tension between maybe like a concerted, like, you know, activist effort to push them away from inclusion. And what we know from so many, polls and different data points, we know that Gen Z is looking for brands with values associated with them. And so that is something they time and time again will say in research, that is something they look for, and they make decisions about where they buy from based on the stated values or something like this. And I think that if a Gen Z consumer, a younger consumer, looks for that and says they support the Trevor Project, that makes me feel good about giving them money. Like that is something that younger consumers consistently want. And I think that is it's like, we know that that's happening. So how does a brand do that and be prepared to do that when they want to target those younger consumers that are going to grow and get older and develop that lifelong brand affinity and get more purchasing power, et cetera, when we also have like this maybe tail end of maybe older sometimes consumers, not always, but like who are like, oh my gosh, I don't want to see, you know what? It's like, it's such a weird, it's like a balance. And I kind of think it's like, you kind of have to pick one and go with it.
I think as a brand too, you have to recognize the activists that are clamoring for you to not speak out on inclusion. Are those even your core audience members? Like, are those even your consumers? Because if they're not, I don't think you need to worry so much about like the news cycle that follows, because ultimately it's not going to hurt your bottom line. And I think going back to the examples of like Target, like people were more angry that they pulled back a couple years ago on their Pride collection because their base ultimately was supportive of their Pride collection. So who's to say that the people who were protesting them were even going to make a difference? And I think we've seen now, a few years later, Target's still kind of struggling. And it shows that those people, like by appeasing the people who were protesting, it didn't necessarily lead to the business results that I think Target was hoping it would lead to.
Yeah, I feel like I personally heard so much more about the impact of the subsequent boycott of Target pulling back their Pride and DEI initiatives than even the initial one that caused them to do this. So it's knowing who your customers are and figuring out if it's actually worth it to respond to the news cycle or whatever pressures you currently are facing, because it can just have the adverse reaction too. I think we posed at the top, like, can Pride marketing make a comeback? And I think what you said, Kelsey, about Gen Z being, we know that they care a lot about what their brands stand for. I feel like Pride marketing in particular seems like it'll make a comeback when companies kind of like collectively are like, oh, Gen Z is now older. Gen Z is now holding more purchasing power, and we know this about Gen Z. And I'm like waiting to see like when that shift will be from like the older generation to the younger generation and kind of taking them seriously in that way. Because I think we talk a lot about it, but it's like, when will that become like the superseding point of view as we move forward here?
Once there's less of a threat from the federal government of pushback, I think brands will kind of go through a reset where they are doing more for Pride, but maybe not in the way that we were seeing pre this era politically, because I think, again, with the rainbow washing and things like that, brands know that, like, in order to be received positively, it has to appeal to their audience base and has to feel genuine and authentic to their brand. So my hope is that brands start to, slowly speak up more as it becomes safe to do so, and make sure that whatever they do say has something behind it.
Yeah. It's so interesting, that phrase of like, as it becomes safe to do so, because it's also like, as brands choose to do so, I think it also creates a sense of safety. As we said, like, there is like kind of the safety in numbers, and people were jumping on originally getting into Pride Month as a marketing moment because everyone was doing it. And I think I'm curious to see if that will kind of recreate itself as we move, as trends are always cyclical. Like, the pendulum will swing, and it has to swing back. It's just a matter of when that actually happens.
And I think, all of this is to say, like, this, I'm not exactly surprised to see this. Like, Pride, like, as a concept is like a radical celebration. And so corporations in general are not necessarily known for being trailblazers in terms of like being radical in certain things. So it's like, it really does, require that mindset shift. But I think what it might do is just create a room for a lot more intentionality, more conversations. It's not like oh my gosh, it's almost the end of May. What are we doing for Pride? Shoot, we could do one meeting on it and try to do something. But like, what does that look like over the course of the year? What is happening internally, externally? Like, what are we doing that's meaningful and impactful that, again, is visible to that savvy consumer who is also very skeptical of something that feels like a cash grab, right? Like, we know that consumers are like, have their spidey senses on. They're like, this feels inauthentic. And so I think that maybe will level set. What I do wonder is if brands are going to show up to support these big IRL experiences, like Pride, like NYC Pride or other Pride celebrations around the country. We talk about this all the time. Brands love IRL activations. We know that that's a moment to build community and really get people feeling connected and genuine, and that just develop a lot of really positive associations. So I think there's a big opportunity for brands there. I do think it might be a couple years before we see that come back.
Yeah, especially with Pride being like, the whole point of it is to celebrate like queer joy. Like, we talk a lot about like why brands show up in IRL moments, and it's to associate themselves with positive emotion.
Positivity,
And that is the exact point of that event happening, and just being able to be a part of that feels like a no-brainer. But I agree, it's swung so far the other way that it's going to take a little bit of time to swing back this way. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. And if you have thoughts on where the future of Pride marketing might be heading, send us an email at mkbw@morningbrew.com, which you can also find in the show notes. And we'll catch you next week.